introduce Jacqueline Comeau, who is a wildlife biologist at the Vermont Fish and Wildlife Department. And she's been researching the effect wind development has on the black bear population in Searsburg and Bennington?
Reedsboro, but
Reedsboro.
yeah.
None of our bears are affected?
Oh, they kind of share the
Okay,
landscape.
then why don't you come on up and explain yourself?
So yeah, I will be talking about your black bears here in Bennington too, because we've learned that the bears that live up in the mountains in Searsburg and Reedsboro often spend a lot of time down in the Bennington-Pownell Valley as well. So, before I get into the details of the study though, I first just want to point out that the study is still ongoing. So I'm going to talk about why we're doing the study, how we're collecting data, and what the data is showing us so far. But I don't have any hard results yet. We're still probably a year to a year and a half out from having the final results. So this is just kind of like a progress update for you all to understand what we're doing. I first want to talk a little bit about the Vermont Fish and Wildlife Department to just provide some context to why we're doing the study. So our mission is the conservation of Vermont's fish, wildlife, plants, and their habitats for all the people of Vermont. So we're responsible for the conservation of all the animals and plants here in Vermont, which is a big list for a department that has limited resources. So unfortunately, we don't have these detailed conservation management plans for every species here in Vermont, but black bears are a species that we've decided to prioritize and have a pretty detailed conservation plan for. And so for black bears, we have like a four-part approach. We oversee the state's bear hunting season. So we make sure that people are following the regulations set for the bear hunting season. And then we work cooperatively with bear hunters to collect data about the animals they harvest. And that data helps us generate population estimates of how many bears we have in the state. And so with their cooperation, we're able to kind of monitor if our populations are growing, decreasing, or stable. We also spend a lot of time managing conflicts between people and bears. And I could honestly spend an hour today talking with you about that topic specifically, but just know that we're here to provide technical assistance if any of you are dealing with conflicts and bears. We also spend a lot of effort conserving and managing habitat for black bears. We do this by working with private landowners to help them improve habitat components on their land. We actively conserve land and purchase land for conservation. And we also spend a lot of time managing state-owned lands to improve habitat. And then more relevant to tonight's talk, we also review, through the state's regulatory review process, development projects for potential impacts to rare, threatened, and endangered wildlife species, and impacts to deer wintering habitat and critical bear habitat. And I'll talk about that more in a minute. And then finally, we occasionally engage in research projects where we try to better understand Vermont's bears' needs. And those research projects typically are centered around how human development impacts our black bears. So like I said, we can't have this level of detail for every species in Vermont, unfortunately. But why we decided black bears are a priority species is because they serve as what we call an umbrella species for a lot of Vermont's other wildlife. And that's because black bears are a far-ranging species, and they're an omnivore that needs access to lots of different types of foods. So for black bears to be successful in Vermont, they need access to wetland habitats for a lot of the plants they need to eat. They need access to what we call young forest habitats for a lot of the berries that they like to eat. And then they also need access to mature forests where there's lots of down woody debris where insects are, and also because those mature forests tend to have trees like oaks, beech, black cherry, and different trees that produce nuts and fruits that bears need to eat. And then, of course, they need to live in a landscape where they can safely move between all of these different habitat types. And so if we're doing a good job to provide all of this habitat for bears, it means we're also providing space for a lot of the other animals that live here in Vermont. But we can't, like I was saying before, that regulatory review process where we're looking to protect or prevent the degradation of critical habitat for black bears. You know, we can't say that all of Vermont's wetlands and all of Vermont's young forest areas and all of Vermont's mature forests are off limits to development, because that's unrealistic. So we have to prioritize what we consider critical bear habitat. And we've designated what we call bear-scarred beech concentrations as critical habitat for bears. And so these are areas where you have a lot of mature beech trees that have these telltale scars on their trunks, which are the scars bears make from climbing the trees to eat the nuts out of the trees. Beechnuts, despite being a really small nut, pack a high caloric punch for bears. And research has shown that it's really their preferred nut species to eat. So in areas where you have both beech trees and acorns, if there are beechnuts available, bears will typically choose to go to those beech areas instead of the oak areas. And research out of Maine actually showed that female bears will synchronize their reproduction with these beechnut cycles. And what I mean by that is that beechnuts tend to only produce a lot of nuts every other year, and mature female bears only give birth to cubs every other year. And so what Maine was finding is that in areas where beechnuts were an important food for bears, females were giving birth to cubs in the winters following falls with a lot of beechnuts. So we feel like the evidence is out there that these areas are an important food source for bears. And so when we're reviewing those development projects in the state, if we know that there are a lot of these bear-scarred beech trees in the area where the development is happening, we try to work with the developers to either find a new site for their development or try to minimize the potential impacts on these important areas. And so that brings us to the Deerfield Wind Energy Project. So most of you have probably seen the turbines now up in Searsburg and Reedsboro. This project is the first wind energy development project on national forest in the country. And why our department got involved was because of the amount of bear-scarred beech associated with the ridges where they built this project. So these black polygons on this map represent known concentrations of bear-scarred beech. And these pink triangles on this map represent the location of each of the turbines associated with the wind project. And so you can see on what we call the West Ridge, which is this one up here, the turbines are being built right through the center of one of those large concentrations. And then on the East Ridge, even though they're not being built within the bear-scarred beech, they're built kind of really in close proximity to those beech stands. So our department was concerned primarily with the West Ridge and how many beech trees were going to have to be removed just to put in the road and the turbines. And then we were also concerned about whether or not bears would still feel comfortable feeding on those beech trees in such close proximity to these really large industrial wind turbines. However, folks who were in favor of the wind project argued that there's still going to be a lot of beech left on these ridge lines after the project is built. And they also argued that bears are a very flexible species and they will kind of learn to adjust to the presence of these wind turbines. But in the end, no one has ever looked at the impacts of wind turbines and black bear behavior. So the Vermont Public Service Board ultimately granted the permit to build the wind project, but with the stipulation that the energy company needed to mitigate for the habitat they'd be destroying. So they needed to conserve at least 144 acres of bear-scarred beech somewhere else in southern Vermont, and they needed to fund a study to understand what impacts this facility has on black bears. So that brings us to our study. Our objectives are primarily to evaluate the habitat use and movements of bears in this area before the wind energy project was built, and then compare those movements after the wind energy is the wind energy project is in operation. And so we're basically just looking at, do the bears use those bear-scarred beach concentrations less after the wind project goes into operation? If we see a change in how they're using those beach stands, what does that change look like? For example, are they now only going into the beach at night? And if we find that bears are displaced, meaning they no longer want to go up onto those ridge lines to feed on beech nuts, where are they going to find an alternative food? And one of our fears has been that they might start looking in people's backyards for an alternative food. So the timeline of the study, we began collaring black bears in the fall of 2011. And what we're doing, we collar them is we're putting GPS satellite collars on them, which I have an example of one on the table when you first walked in. And so these collars are collecting GPS locations as the bear moves across the landscape. So that began in the fall of 2011. The fall of 2006, the Deerfield Wind Energy Project began construction. So that means we had 5 years of kind of pre-construction data, so kind of like 5 years of baseline data telling us how bears were using the landscape. In the spring of 2018, the energy project went online. And we're expecting that in the spring of 2021, the study will end. And the reason for that is because, again, what we're really keyed into is understanding how they're reacting to beech nuts with and without the wind project. And so those red circled years are years when we had good beechnut production in this area. So we had 2 good beechnut years during that kind of pre-development phase, 1 good beechnut year during construction, and now this fall is turning out to be a really good beechnut year. So this is going to be our good beechnut year post-operation. So during that time frame, we've had 45 different bears collared, but typically we have anywhere from 8 to 14 collared in any given year. We're focusing on capturing bears in Reedsboro and Searsburg because we want to collar bears who stand a good chance of actually using those beach stands. But what we found, oh, and before I jump to that, you're probably wondering what that red polygon is. That's called a virtual fence. So these collars are pretty high tech. They're programmed to recognize that polygon, and when bears go inside of that polygon, they collect a location every 20 minutes. And when the bears are outside of that polygon, they're collecting a location every 3-ish hours. So we're getting really detailed information of how these bears are acting and what they're doing when they're really close to the Deerfield Wind Project. And so, like I said, we're really focused on that Deerfield Wind Project area, but once we started putting collars on bears in Reedsboro and Searsburg, we learned that effectively our study area was much larger than that. Bears travel long distances. And so really we learned that Route 9 kind of sets a rough northern limit to where most of these bears would go. It seems to be a barrier, and a lot of bears don't like crossing it. Harriman Reservoir, and then down along the lower part of the Deerfield River Valley seems to be kind of the eastern edge of where the bears typically go. Route 2 in Massachusetts is kind of the southern edge of where they'll go. And then just across the line in New York, kind of the Taconic Mountains seems to be the western edge. And again, bears do what bears want to do. So we still have plenty of bears that will travel way outside of here, but this is kind of the core area where we're collecting a lot of data. So now I'm going to kind of go through a few specifics of examples of what we've been learning from bears so far. And I'm going to start with a couple examples of what we saw before the Deerfield Wind Project construction began. So this is a female bear who we had collared for a number of years. All these points are GPS locations that her collar collected. That blue square kind of roughly represents the core area of what we considered her home range, which was really centered around the Atherton Meadows Wildlife Management Area. But you'll see you've got these points that kind of go farther south into Mass, and then these points that go up north towards the Deerfield Wind Project. And I kind of want to focus in on those for a minute. So, in the fall of 2015, it was really good beechnut year, and it was before Deerfield Wind began construction. This female bear traveled about 7.5 kilometers northwest to those bear scar beach concentrations that we were interested in understanding. And she spent about 2 months up there, presumably feeding on beechnuts, before then returning to her core home range area in Atherton Meadows. It was by like early November where she denned for the year. And this was really cool for us because we knew that these beach stands weren't just important for bears whose typical home ranges overlapped with them. We really thought these beach stands are big enough that they're drawing bears in away from their home ranges to seek out this food source in these good years. And so this bear highlighted that, yeah, bears were willing to travel to get to these beach stands. Another cool thing that we learned from this bear and others is that in years where beechnut production was really poor, like in the fall of 2014 when these points were collected, she couldn't go up to those ridge lines to get beechnuts, but instead she traveled south into Massachusetts where there's a lot more oak trees, and she spent about 2 months down in Massachusetts feeding on acorns before again returning to her core home range area in Atherton Meadows to den for the winter. And she's not the only bear that did this. In the fall of 2014, we had another adult female whose core home range was up along the northwest edge of Harriman Reservoir. Unfortunately, this map is a little washed out, but in late August, or early August actually, she made a southern movement down into Massachusetts where she spent most of August, September, and most of October before ultimately returning back to her home range to den. And again, this map's washed out, but what's kind of cool if you can see the colors better is that these areas where she's hanging out in Massachusetts, those are state lands down there. So those are public conserved lands where all these oak trees are. So this started to highlight to us the importance of the conservation work happening not just here in Vermont for our bears, but also in Massachusetts. And the other cool thing was that this sow, when she made this trip south, she had 2 cubs of the year with her. So those little cubs traveled with her down into Massachusetts. So the best we can guess is that she's teaching her cubs where food is and where to go to find food. And so this is just a really kind of interesting insight into how these bears are learning how to find food. All right, so now let's talk about some male bears who have much bigger home ranges. This was a 3- and 4-year-old male that we had collared. We nicknamed him Tony because you can see he had this huge cluster of points around Mount Anthony here in Bennington. But you can see, I mean, he traveled all throughout our study area. And this is typical for males, especially younger males who are still kind of establishing a core home range area. And really, a 4-year-old male is what we would still consider a sub-adult male. It's usually not until they're 5 or 6 and older that they start getting big enough and kind of savvy enough to be able to participate in the breeding season and to start being able to push other bears around. So, I want to focus on a few of his movements in 2017 during the fall, which again was a good beechnut year, and this is during the construction phase of the Deerfield project. So, he started around Mount Anthony, and this was September 23rd. He then moved up to the beach stands. You can see on the 24th of September at almost 10:30 p.m., he got into the first kind of beach concentration, but then within 24 hours, he kind of skirted through all the beach stands and left, and came back down here to the Route 7 Valley. So we saw that, and we're like, well, that's weird. We know there's a lot of beechnuts up there. You know, late September is a little bit early, but that's usually kind of the prime time when bears start climbing the beech trees because they can't wait for the nuts to fall, and so they're climbing up to eat nuts directly out of the trees. So we kind of scratched our heads, like, why didn't he stay up there? I don't know. Again, we thought maybe it was a little bit early, so we waited, and then by like mid-October, so the 19th, he again made this movement up into the Bear Scar Beach, but again did not stay. And this time he did this huge walkabout. So that's him skirting around the south end of Somerset Reservoir, and he hit the Kelly Stand Road just north of Somerset before he ultimately crossed Route 7 between Arlington and Sunderland. He then looped around through New York, came back and crossed Route 7 in Shaftesbury, and then headed south before again crossing Route 9 and ending up just south of Bennington in some of the cornfields. So again, we scratched our head. Why was he doing this when we know there was plenty of food right up on those ridge lines where he headed? Again, probably one thought could be that the construction phase was so disruptive that he didn't feel comfortable staying there. Maybe another argument is, again, he's only a 4-year-old bear. Maybe he came up there and got pushed around by another bear and said, screw this, I'm going somewhere else. But what's interesting about this is all these movements can be dangerous for bears. He crossed Route 9 twice, and he crossed Route 7 twice. Both are major roads where bears often get hit. So there are risks with taking these big walkabouts. So we're going to look at one more male bear during this time period. And this male bear we've been collared for a long time. So in 2017, I think he was around 8 years old at that point. So he was a mature bear. And you can again see his home range extends pretty much the entire study area. So on October 11th, he started leaving kind of his core area and traveled up through the beach stands. But again, he did not stay. And instead of going north like that last bear, he instead continued east. He skirted south around Harriman, cut through Whitingham, Halifax, Marlborough, before ending in Brattleboro. Hit the outskirts of busy Brattleboro, and immediately turned around, came back. But again, he wasn't moving quickly. You can see these clusters of spots where he's stopping to eat along the way. Goes around Harriman Reservoir again, finally finds a way to get across Route 8, where he again ends up in a beach stand within his own core home range area. So again, this made us scratch our heads. Here's a mature bear who shouldn't be getting pushed around by other bears. He also went up and checked out those beach stands, but chose not to stay. So again, like I said, we have not summarized all the data yet. We haven't analyzed the data using stats or anything like that yet. So I can't say for sure what's going on. But these two bears make us think, all right, at least during the construction phase, something was going on that made these bears uncomfortable to be up on those ridge lines. But I don't want to give you the impression that bears are fleeing those ridge lines, because we still have plenty of bears who are spending time up there. And this female is a good example of that. So all these points, she's another one we had collared for quite a number of years. Her core area is really centered right on the ridge lines where the wind project went in. And so here, in the fall of 2015, which again was before construction had begun, another really good Beechnut year, you can see her points are just almost perfectly mirroring those bear scar beach stands on what we call the West Ridge. And then if you look at her points during that same exact time period, October 1 to November 15th in 2017 during construction, she didn't leave the area, but you can see she really shifted which parts of the beach stands she was using. So again, this also kind of makes us think, yeah, we probably are seeing some level of displacement happening during that construction phase of the wind project. But again, I think we could all agree that we know the construction phase is going to be the most disrupted. They've got big equipment up there. They weren't blasting anymore at this point, but there's a lot of people, there's a lot of equipment. They're erecting the turbines at that point in the fall of 2017. So the real question is going to be to see, like, what do the bears do this fall? Now that there aren't people up there anymore, it's just the turbine spinning. And like I said, we're still in the process of collecting that data. And I'll say we have some bears who are still hanging out up on the ridge lines, and we have other bears who've kind of traveled longer distances to see beach in other areas. So maybe in another year and a half, I can come back and say exactly what we found this fall. But another thing I just want to point out that may be interesting to you guys living here in Bennington is that we do see bears using this valley a fair amount, but it's often risky for them. So here's a male bear we had collared from 2013 to 2015, and you can see his core home range area was more in Reedsboro over to Whitingham, and then we'd also go down into Massachusetts. But in the fall of 2015, actually, just before beechnuts really became ripe, so it was actually like late summer, like August, he started traveling down into the valley to take advantage of the cornfields here. And in early September, he was harvested in one of those cornfields. And so we've seen this a lot from male bears that we collar up in the mountains. In late summer, before the nuts are ready, but the berries have already gone by for the most part, we see them dropping down into the valley here, or going down into some of the valleys in Mass or over in New York to take advantage of corn. And so it does make them very vulnerable. So this is one of those risky alternative food sources that's out there tempting bears out of the woods and putting them at risk. So along with collaring these animals, we're also getting some interesting population level data. So we primarily catch these bears with collars on them during the spring and early summer when they're breeding. But once they're collared, the easiest time for us to go in and replace collars and to adjust the fit of collars is when they're in their winter den. And so when we do this for females, we're able to count how many cubs they're having. And then because cubs will den with their mothers, so they're born in the den, and then they'll return that next winter to den with their mother, we can see how many of those cubs are surviving through that first year of their life, which is really the hardest year for a bear. So we're getting a little bit of information about how the reproduction and survival is in our bear population in this part of the state. And then on top of the collaring, we also have established 4 sampling plots where we have 10 wildlife cameras in each plot. And so we're using those to kind of get an estimate of not necessarily how many bears are spending time near the Deerfield Wind Project, but how much time bears are spending there, and what are they doing when they are up on those ridge lines. And so I haven't summarized all of that data yet, but I'll say in the first fall that we had the cameras out, which was 2015, when we had really good beechnut production, we collected almost 2,500 pictures of bears. So a lot of pictures of bears. And then the next fall, when beechnut production was really poor and construction for the wind project had started, you can see we only got like 244 pictures. So this again just highlights that bears are really spending a lot of time in that area when the food is there. Kind of the more interesting part of the camera data, though, is that it is giving us this glimpse into bear behavior. So the collars are just showing us a point on a map, which is interesting. It tells us where bears are spending their time and how they're moving. But the cameras are showing us what are they actually doing on the ground. And so we're getting lots of pictures of bears foraging for beechnuts, climbing trees. But then we're also getting these really cool pictures of bears just being bears and doing things that we wouldn't have expected necessarily. So the series of these bears, pictures of these bears fighting, this is actually, you can see one of the bears is wearing a collar. And so we knew that was a subadult male bear. We don't know who those other 2 bears are that he's spending time with. But they're around the same size, so we can assume they're probably 2 other subadult male bears, you know, somewhere in the ages of like 2 to 3 years old. And we've got lots of pictures like this of this group of 3 bears, and then we had a few groups of just 2 bears traveling together, fighting, wrestling,
And again, it doesn't seem like they're aggressively fighting with each other. It seems more like teenage bears roughhousing. And so that's been kind of interesting. And these pictures were actually collected not in the beach stands, but at the higher elevation just above the beach stands on the east ridge. And so it almost seems to us like the bears are kind of hanging out just above the beach stands. And maybe what was going on is bigger dominant bears were down in the beach feeding. And so these younger males were kind of hanging out, killing time until they could go down in the beach when those bigger bears had left. We're also reliably getting great pictures of white-tailed deer within the beach. We're getting lots of pictures of moose, particularly on the east ridge at that high elevation. Pretty much every spring we get pictures of a cow and newborn calf up there. So it seems to be important calving habitat for our moose. We're also getting great pictures of a lot of Vermont's other species like coyote and bobcat and fisher and turkey and grouse and snowshoe hare and porcupines. And so we may be able to use this data to help say something about if the wind project is influencing how these other species use those ridge lines. And then in closing, I just want to say, we know that renewable energy is going to be a part of Vermont's energy future. And I'm not necessarily here to debate the pros and cons of wind energy versus fossil fuels. But we're trying to better understand as we move forward with this energy source, how it's impacting our wildlife so that we can be thoughtful on how we're moving forward with this energy type and trying to be considerate of our wildlife's needs along with it. I just want to give a big thank you because this has been a lot of effort for this study. It's not something that our department has been able to do by ourselves. We have a team of amazing volunteers and interns who have helped with all of our field work. The Forest Service has helped a lot with field work. USDA Wildlife Services and Westing both helped in the early stages of the study. And then if you guys are ever up in Manchester, I highly recommend stopping in at Mrs. Murphy's Donuts. They've been kind enough to give us their old throwaway donuts, which is what has allowed us to catch as many bears as we have. The bears love those donuts. And I just want to give also a quick mention, our department is primarily funded through the sales of hunting and fishing licenses and federal taxes on the sales of guns and ammunition. And that's how most wildlife conservation is supported in the United States. But for those of you in the crowd who maybe don't hunt or fish, we do have options for other folks to contribute to the conservation work our department does through our habitat stamp, which obviously goes towards habitat conservation and management. And then we have a non-game fund for threatened and endangered species in the state. And with that, I would love to open it up to questions you guys might have about the study or experiences you've had with bears or collared bears here in Bennington. And I will also say, if you take off, I do have some handouts about how to deal with conflicts and bears, so help yourselves, please.
Questions? Excellent.
Thank you.
You must have a question.
Yeah.
So in the early 60s to late 60s, a similar study was done about is this kind of similar?
Yeah, I guess I'm not familiar with that study specifically, but yeah, this is a pretty typical design for understanding energy development in wildlife. Look at what the animals are doing before the development happens and what they're doing afterwards, and kind of compare and contrast to see if there are differences.
Because a similar finding up to the building was found at and that it was deer and other mammals, crossing, but it was right in their path also. So what happened was after they built the pipeline, all the animals came back. It was like they got used to the noise.
Yeah, and that's, one thing we've thought about with this study, and we'll see what we find this fall. And again, it's actually going to be interesting to see even in the spring what the bears do, because the cool thing about beechnuts is because of their really hard shell, they persist under the snow all winter. So bears will often return to the beech stands in early spring to continue feeding on nuts. But, one thing we've been talking about is running these collars is really expensive, and so unfortunately that will probably have to end by that 2021 deadline. But I think we may try to keep the cameras out longer because that's a much more inexpensive way to monitor what's going on. And so if we do see real displacement happening this first fall, I'm curious to see if over time that amount of displacement decreases as bears are able to kind of adjust. And if we do see displacement, again, it'd be interesting to see if they do adjust over time, because maybe they won't, but
How much do the collars cost to operate?
they're usually a little over $2,000 a collar, and then they're satellite collars, so like your cell phone, we have like monthly fees that we have to pay, which they're minimum. The monthly fees are minimal, but it's like giving your cell phone to a destructive teenage boy, though. We're putting these collars on animals that love to fight, they love to rub on things, they love to crawl into tight spaces, they swim, and so really the limiting factor is these batteries eventually run out, and so every 1.5 to 2.5 years we have to replace them. But we've also had collars that were we had one collar that was just torn apart by a male bear. He was able to pull it off, and then he just crunched it. Yeah, and we have sows who have cubs and yearlings with them. They're always like roughhousing with her, and so we're putting some expensive technology on animals that do not respect how much it costs.
What about chips?
Yeah, so there are chips you can put in like wild animals like you would with like your dogs, so like we call it a pit tag. But the issue is that they don't have like the GPS satellite component. So places that put pit tags in wild animals, you have to have like a reader, and you literally have to scan it, have the animal in hand to scan it to see if it's the same animal. So the technology's not there for that with these guys yet, though.
How do you put the collars on?
Yeah, it's a great question. So primarily I use traps. And we have 2 types of traps that we use that are both designed for the humane capture of bears. And like I said, I do most of the trapping in late spring and early summer because that's when natural foods are least available for bears, so they're more inclined to come into those donuts. And I also use sweet goat grain because I don't like putting out tons of donuts for them, so I kind of mix up the food a bit. And so we use those traps, and also breeding is happening in the spring and early summer, so the bears get a little less cautious while they're in the midst of breeding. And then if we need to catch more bears, we have a few houndsmen who live locally in the area, and so we work with them and their dogs to chase bears up trees and then catch them that way. And so when a bear's in a trap, we actually have a really fancy piece of equipment called a jab stick. And it's just a long metal stick with a needle and syringe on the end that we load with drug. And these traps basically tether the bear to a tree, or occasionally we use what's called a culvert trap, so they're in basically like a big cage. But with the hounds, we usually have a dart gun. So it's kind of like a .22 size rifle that just shoots a dart. We hit them right in the butt where they have a lot of muscle. And that's how we get our hands on them to put the collars on, which is not an easy feat.
I noticed there's a fence and something around the windmills. I don't know if the whole area is fenced.
It is not. So one of the requirements was that they gate the roads. Because again, so this is on the National Forest, so all this land is our land, it's public land, we own it. So they're not putting fences up saying the public's not allowed up there anymore, but they have gated the roads so that people can't be using the roads, which is probably a good thing from wildlife's perspective because it helps. part of why these ridge lines we think were so important to bears is because of their remote nature. And so it's a safe place for the bears to go to get food far away from people. So keeping those roads gated is an attempt to kind of keep, to not increase the amount of people that are going up there. I will say, so you can hike up there, just bushwhack up there anytime, but I will say you want to be careful not to do that in the winter because ice can build up on those blades and the blades will throw the ice. So it's not a safe place to be anymore in the winter, I would say.
How do the bears deal with fences along the major highways?
Well, bears are good climbers, so if they really want to get by a fence, they'll just climb it. And honestly, where we see that more of an issue is people will sometimes put fences around like their dumpsters, thinking like, hey, that'll keep the bear out. And really what it does is the bear just will climb it over a fence, and then you go in there, and now the bear's stuck in a tight space with you. So fences are not a good way to keep a bear out of someplace it really wants to go. Along highways, though, most wildlife will hit a fence and travel until they find a gap if they really want to get through. But bears can climb so easily that they can kind of go either way. Justin, you have a question?
From what I've understood about bears is they put a lot of emphasis on their own hearing for protection. Their eyes are not good,
Yeah.
but their hearing is fantastic, as well as their nose. And when they climb beech trees, that is their most vulnerable time. And to try to compare a wind turbine site with a pipeline site, I think would be entirely different, because when I'm around an operating wind turbine site, which I've been around many, I cannot use a cell phone. I can't even hear the person on the other end of the cell phone. That is how loud the turbines are when you're up close to them. It's a whole lot different than when you back off a mile. When you're up close, it is an industrial site with constant banging and loud noise. I don't know where this banging comes from, but it happens every few seconds.
Yeah.
That there's like a shotgun blast going on. And I would think that may affect the comfort of these bears when they're especially climbing these beech trees.
And that's exactly what was concerning to us. Like I said before, it wasn't just the loss of that 144 acres that had to be cut down, but then, again, I was just saying how we felt like these ridgelines, part of the attraction was the remote nature of them. And so, even though people aren't necessarily going to be up there, because the folks that work at the wind project are told this time of year they're supposed to limit how much time they spend up on the ridgelines. But still, the noise from those turbines, is that going to make bears feel uncomfortable to continue climbing these trees? Because like you said, when they're up in the tree, they're safe, but they're stuck there. And so it does make them more vulnerable in some ways. Yeah.
Is there any, as part of your study, is there any coordination between the bear travel and location and the turbines in operation?
Yeah, so we're going to get information from them. We haven't talked real specifics with them yet, but my understanding is they're going to be sharing some information with us in terms of like the wind turbine activity. And I don't know if they're going to be giving us exact like output numbers, because I think some of that they're a little protective of. But we're going to kind of compare, okay, we're going to look at changes in bear movements and location, but then we also want to kind of throw that in as a variable to look at as well, like how active are the turbines and is that influencing when they're there and when they're not there?
The reason I ask is because it's well known that frequencies from 8 to 15 hertz make people very uncomfortable, and I'm just wondering if it's spinning off harmonics in that range, because it would affect the wildlife as well.
Yeah, and it's going to be, like I said, it's a little bit harder to measure because again, their ears are different than ours, and we only have so much understanding of what's going to how they're going to interpret sound compared to how we do. But
Well, it's not only hearing the sounds, it's being subject to that frequency within the body.
Yeah. So we are going to attempt to get as much of that information to kind of compare to.
There is noise monitoring going on for humans, and the wind company is turning over all the SCADA data.
Oh, perfect.
so I don't see you would have any trouble getting it. I wanted to, maybe you could go back to one of the slides that shows your whole study area.
Yeah.
And point out the wind project to the south, the Iberdrola, Avangrid, Hoosac wind project,
Oh.
which happens to be in your study area.
Yeah, it is.
And you can see it on some of the maps that you've got.
I go way back.
And I was just wondering,
You can see it here, so it's kind of like right here.
yeah, there are two ridge lines, and it's an interesting opportunity. You started the monitoring in 2011, so I believe that was when that project was under construction, and I think it came online the end of 2012.
Yeah, I started working on this project in 2014, so it was already there when I started here, but I know it was recent.
Well, I don't know what sort, I mean, I think it's some of it's state forest, but in any case, as you're looking at this, are you paying any attention to the impact of that wind project too?
We are, and so it's a little bit different because the bears we're collaring, most of them are more core to this area, but what we do see is that, it's hard to tell on this map, but this ridgeline has beach as well. This is part of the national forest right up to the Vermont-Mass border, and then you drop south into Mass, and there's the Hoosac project. And so we have seen a number of bears in those years where they're dropping into Massachusetts using these ridge lines. And so it's definitely going to be in our analysis looking at how they're using that as well. And especially because we know there's some beach, at least on the Vermont side of it. So, yeah.
Is there a plan to plant more beech trees?
No. Again, growing trees is a very slow process, and honestly, beech, they're good at regenerating themselves. However, we do have the beech bark disease, which I'm not sure how familiar you all are with that, but if you walk into a beech forest, 50 to 100 years ago, you'd see these beautiful, smooth-barked trees, and now all of our trees are all poxed and cracked bark, and that's from the beech bark disease. So our beech trees are under a lot of stress. However, they're still producing enough nuts to seem to be serving a real value to our wildlife. And again, not just bears, a lot of species feed on beech nuts. The bigger issue is that because of the beech bark disease, beech trees have really lost their kind of timber value. And so it's not a desirable tree for a lot of private landowners. The national forests, fortunately, are kind of subject to, they're considering financial value from their trees, but they're also equally weighing in wildlife habitat value. So we still have a lot of beech in the Green Mountain National Forest. And one thing I didn't mention in the beginning, when we got really concerned when we saw this project and all the beech that's there, is that these are like some of the largest concentrations of bear-scarred beech that we have left in the entire state. And so that was kind of concerning to us because we're like, oh, they're on the national forest. We just assumed they were protected, and that's not really the case. But in terms of planting, so yeah, that's kind of the issue we're dealing with. Is we're trying to maintain these beech trees where they are. We're trying to encourage landowners when they can consider wildlife as part of their management of their forests. If they do have some bear-scarred beech trees, to try to leave them and maybe consider allowing future beech trees to grow up and manage towards beech in certain areas. But it's tricky to just go out and plant them, especially in a state like Vermont that's so forested and we have so many different tree species competing. It's almost better off to just kind of let nature take its course a little bit. But I will say that I was just speaking with one of the site managers recently for Deerfield, and the Forest Service does have requirements for them in terms of plantings and revegetation along the roads and under the turbines themselves. And so they are going to try to manage for blackberry and raspberry bushes and things that will produce what we call soft mass or berries for bears. But I will say that blackberries and beech nuts are both valuable to bears, but a beech nut has a lot more calories and fat, and it's a more important food for bears. So it's not a one-to-one trade-off, unfortunately. Yeah.
Has there been another beach stand found to mitigate what has taken away from the bear?
Yeah, so it's a long story with that, and I haven't been as involved in the mitigation side of it. But we've now mitigated well over the 144 acres. They're not right here in this area, which is one kind of bummer, I think. But they are in southern Vermont. They are within kind of travel distance. It's kind of the far end of travel distance for bears. But there's been 3 different projects, 2 of which I think are final at this point, and a third one is still in the works. And the cool thing is, so the requirement was for 144 acres, but each of those projects are well above that. They don't necessarily contain all Bear Scar Beach on them. I think one project is around 200 acres, another is around 500 or 600 acres, and then the one that's in the works right now is like over 4,000 acres. And so this mitigation money has been used to leverage all 3 of those. So in the end, we're talking about thousands of acres that are getting conserved, and Bear Scar Beach is a component of each in excess of the 144 acres. Yeah.
We're in Searsburg on Route 8.
All right.
The clearing just to the east that you can see on the blown up map.
Okay.
And you mentioned when they were doing the construction, this was not when they were doing the blasting. Well, the blasting was a season before.
Right.
So that was a year and a half consecutive of heavy equipment in
Yes.
blasting, 500 pounds at a pop. Plus they took away hundreds of beech trees. Have you seen the bear come back to that area? Because there was a mama bear that you had tagged with 2 cubs that we've seen on our cameras multiple times until they started blasting. Now, no signs of bear whatsoever.
Yeah.
And we're right next to the project, right on Route 8.
I will say, so we had that one sow I showed the kind of the 2 different maps side by side. She never, well, it depends on when you get pictures. She never was very successful with keeping cubs alive for very long. But she was harvested during the hunting season last year. So if that was the bear you were seeing, that's why you're not seeing her anymore.
Have you seen bear come back to that
Yeah,
area
we have.
in the amount that were there 3 years ago?
Bears that we had collared who lived in that area have stayed in that area. We haven't seen any bears abandon their home range. What we're seeing, kind of like what I showed with that map of the female, is maybe these like, what I would call like micro shifts within their home range. And so just shifting and using things differently. But yeah, we haven't seen any totally abandon the area. However, again, we've got a sample of bears collared. It's not every bear that lives in this area, but the idea is we've got enough bears collared to be a representative sample. And this is partially why we are using the cameras too, is because we're collaring a small number of animals, but we know in theory more bears are kind of being sucked into these beach stands, at least before the project was built. And so that's going to be an interesting thing, which I haven't started comparing yet, but I said we had over like close to 2,500 pictures of bears in that year before.
We have 10 cameras on the house. I haven't seen a bear since they started the construction up there on the cameras. They take a picture every minute.
Well, I will say...
So my parents bought the property because you could hear the bear. They were bedding down in the yard. They're nowhere around anymore.
I will say we still, like I said, we still have 3 or 4 bears that were collared in that area before that are still there. We lose bears to hunting season every year. We lose bears to conflict situations. We lose bears to getting hit on the roads. And then we have bears that are just pulling their collars off. But
I'm almost 60 years old. We have blackberries in the yard. There's never been a season when I haven't seen bears in the yard until they started the construction.
Well, I'd be curious to get, like, if you don't mind showing me on the map afterwards where exactly you are.
Oh, no problem.
Yeah.
One more question, and then we got a couple of program notes.
Okay.
And one more.
Yeah, from the back.
I'd like to give you a little information. Not so much for you, but for the public. The Forest Service has a sale, they do not remove their product. It's just part of the national forest policy. 16, 18 inches diameter, not a pimple on it, not a claw mark or anything. Why that is, I don't know, because they do have nuts during the years. So maybe it's Bear's way of, well, we'll use them eventually, because they know we don't.
Yeah, I appreciate that. 'Cause the Forest Service, it is good to reiterate, that they are doing a good job managing for beech trees, and making sure this food source is available for wildlife. Yes, thank you.
Okay, we have a couple of program notes, but again, Jacqueline Camo, thank you very, very much. Very good. Sticking around to answer questions and look at the maps with you and all that.